morning, everyone, and welcome to our second session of the day. I hope you've enjoyed the content so far. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce our next panel entitled Drug Discovery and Development in the Era of AI and Analytics. Now, I'm going to hand you straight over to our moderator because I certainly won't do the introduction justice otherwise. Bill Aronson, it is my pleasure to hand over to you, the COO of Artificial Intelligence Research Group.
Thank you, Becky. So this is drug discovery and development in the era of AI and analytics. The life science sector has struggled for years with expensive, inefficient drug discovery and high failure rates in drug development. Now, new technologies like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and data analytics promise to revolutionize biopharma R&D with in-silico drug design, sophisticated analysis of highly complex data sets, and an accelerated path through the clinic and to the market. I'm Bill Aronson, COO of Artificial Intelligence Research Group Limited, a London-based startup. I will be the moderator. With our university partners that include KUL, who invented RSA, and IMEC, the R&D hub for nano and digital technologies, we have developed Sera Plus, the world's most secure anti-counterfeit, patent-pending temperature sensor. Applications include pharma and vaccines. Sera offers irrefutable proof of temperature and authenticity as goods pass through the supply chain. And we now seek partners to commercialize this game-changing technology. So let me introduce our panel of biopharma R&D transformers who will discuss the potential of artificial intelligence and data-driven technologies to create a new digital R&D paradigm. Jackie Hunter is board director of Benevolent AI. Benevolent AI is applying its AI technology across the whole of pharma R&D, from target ID through chemistry to patient stratification and clinical trials. Abraham Heifetz is the co-founder and CEO of Atomwise. Atomwise uses deep learning neural networks to help discover new medicines. Atomwise predicts drug candidates for pharmaceutical companies, startups, and research institutions. It is currently using computational drug design to design drugs against COVID. Martin Emanuel Bittner is a Rhodes Scholar and the co-founder and CEO of Arcturus. Arcturus has developed the world's first fully automated R&D platform to make drug discovery faster, simpler, and better, available for clients to conduct experiments remotely. Arcturus's robotics cloud lab precisely performs experiments 24/7. And finally, Nick Scott-Ram, MBE, is Managing Director, Discovery Sciences at Sensine Health PLC. Sensine Health is a clinical artificial intelligence company operating a unique business model. They are a for-profit PLC making a positive social impact, sharing the financial returns they make with the NHS via equity and a share of revenue. Ladies and gentlemen, has the future arrived? Is the promise of AI and ML and data analytics still some time away, or are we now seeing commercial products? Jackie.
Oh, I think we're definitely seeing commercial products. I'm going to give you two examples. One is from Benevolent, and the other is a more general statement, but I'll use an example of Brainomics, which is a company that I chair the board of. So if we think about the drug development pipeline, clearly it's going to take a long time before we actually see products actually on the market that have been wholly come up with through artificial intelligence. And I know that Abraham will talk a lot more about the chemistry side of things, so I'm not going to touch on that, but clearly there's been huge progress there. The example I use is baricitinib. We were able to use our knowledge graph. So if we think about repurposing, so we can take drugs that are already on the market and find new indications for them, and that's very quick. So in February, we used our knowledge graph to identify molecules that were both anti-inflammatory, but could also have antiviral activity. And out of that emerged the lead that we thought was really promising, which is baricitinib. We published that data. We talked to Eli Lilly, whose drug baricitinib was. It has been in clinical trials as part of the large comparison trial run out of the US. And it was shown to have a positive benefit as an add-on to remdesivir, reducing the time in hospital and reducing symptoms. So, that's an example of where you can very rapidly, I mean, literally in days, pull all the information together, come up with the best opportunity for repurposing in a disease area. And, and for us, it's been brilliant that we've been able to have some impact on the treatment of this horrible disease. If I think about software as a service, it's allowing clinicians to make better decisions. So, for example, through standardizing imaging and analytics very rapidly in stroke, you can analyze the image within a minute, send it to the specialist physician, who can make the decision, should I give this person thrombolysis, should I give this person surgery? And we've seen a huge increase in uplift in treatment rates. So those are just two examples where clearly artificial intelligence is already having an impact. You're on mute, Bill.
Thank you, Jackie. Abraham, you got a segue in there for the chemistry, so please take it.
Yes, thank you, Jackie. Absolutely. I think actually we're entering into a golden age of structure-based drug design, and I think that's going to be enabled in large part by artificial intelligence techniques. I think there's a number of as it always happens with transformations, there's a number of parallel threads which actually all come together to enable the next step, and one of the important ones is AI. But there are other pieces. So if we think about unlocking structure-based drug design, the results this past year from cryo-EM, unlocking new structures of atomic level resolution for traditional drug targets, but things that have been challenging to get structures of, like ion channels. That's very, very interesting. And then quite recently, a few weeks ago, we saw DeepMind actually, according to the CASP challenge, the organizer of the CASP challenge solved the protein folding problem, which had been one of these long-standing grand challenges, and they'd solved it through application of machine learning. And so now we have structures from experiments which are both physical, like cryo-EM, and computational machine learning, like AlphaFold 2, unlocking the structures of a vast array of targets. And what's exciting about that is, if you think about it, the number of human genes that we've ever brought a drug for. I mean, Jackie's exactly right, that if you have a drug, then repurposing is the fastest thing that you could possibly do. But if you think about the set from which we're pulling, only about 4% of human genes have ever had a drug brought against them. And so there's this vast area. There's about 4% have ever been drugged, 16% are genes that have been implicated in human disease, that we have good evidence in human disease, but we've never been able to bring a drug against. And so there's what that means from a commercial point of view, from an economic point of view, is that 4 times the entire pharma industry is just waiting to have molecules brought against them. I mean, there's huge opportunity, huge potential. But to go after things that have never been possible before, we need technologies that have never existed before. And so I think when you look at enabling technologies like protein folding, like small molecule drug prediction, which is what Atomwise is working on, and other steps, I think that's where the future holds. And I think we're about to embark on a golden age of drug design.
Martin, would you agree it's a golden age that we're embarking on?
I can only fully second everything that Jackie and Abram have said. And what I think is always extremely encouraging is to see when the whole ecosystem starts to shift. This is not just a trend where there's 1 or 2 companies or 1 or 2 people, 1 or 2 pioneers saying we need to change things. But instead, if we look, for example, at the famous bench size list, we can see several hundred companies applying AI across the whole chain of drug discovery, from target identification via generative chemistry down towards real-world evidence, clinical trial recruitment. So we can really see that the whole ecosystem is shifting towards a greater adoption of technologies, in particular AI, but also others. And so what I kind of take away from this is that over the next 10 years, I think we're going to see the whole industry probably change in a way that will be very hard to recognize again, because new players are emerging and the established players are going to do very different things. And we're going to think about drug discovery, clinical trials, etc., in very different ways. We've already seen it happening this year where COVID was disrupting clinical trial recruitment, and how quickly pharma companies have been switching to fully virtual trial models was astonishing. And the same way that the FDA is suddenly has been put into a position where they can very rapidly review new findings. And they've already said many of the changes they made to their processes and to their approach are going to be taken forward in the future. So I really do think that we live in a very exciting time, and that this industry is going to go through the same transformational change that many other industries have seen over the past few decades.
Nick, Martin mentions around ecosystem change. Would you like to just say something more about that? Because that seems to be a very interesting point.
Yeah, so I think there is a significant ecosystem change. And I think what's exciting about that is the convergence of technologies applied to problems that may not have been fully solved. So if you look at the sort of AI ecosystem, there's a whole range of companies, from those that access data, and then across the research space, what Abraham was talking about and what Jackie was talking about, all the way through to clinical development, and then ultimately out into the sort of market access side of things, with a multiplicity of potential solutions. So I think if you look across it globally and in different countries, UK, US, Canada, elsewhere, there's a massive shift in interest. And what struck me over the last 2 years is the pace of acceleration of this. It is very, very fast moving. And really where we were 2 years ago compared to where we are today has really been a significant shift. I think what's exciting on the R&D pathway is not only being able to actually look at the mechanisms of drugs, but actually using AI to identify better patients in terms of what you're looking to do in drug discovery, target identification, but all the way through to the clinical development, where you can start to think about real world data combining with clinical trials data, much more structured, but then being able to actually have a better understanding of patient heterogeneity and ultimately then finding the right drug for the right patient, which is what really our focus and interest is.
Great.
I'd just like to, can I just follow up on something Martin said about, COVID really changing how pharma companies are working. I don't know what the other panelists feel, but I certainly feel prior to COVID that a lot of companies, the large companies, were still quite hesitant in terms of engaging with AI, how they were going to do it. And my sense is that COVID has changed that quite dramatically.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think the other side of it, Jack, is with the health system as well.
Yeah.
That's had a huge impact. And I think everyone realizes they've got to change. And I think for pharma, if you look at 80% of trials that were disrupted with COVID, I think everyone's sitting there saying we've got to do things differently. So I'd agree with that.
I think it depends on the company, maybe. If you look at I think every big pharma company had some team internally, right, where they were dipping their toe in and where they were doing lots of pilot projects. But I think a lot of the discussion, and you can see this, represented in some of the more skeptical blogs, science blogs out there. This discussion of like, well, there were neural networks back in the 80s, right? Like, what could possibly be different? We had QSAR back in the 1980s. What could possibly be different? And it's always kind of funny having that conversation, because you kind of want to pull out your cell phone and say, well, let me Google the answer, because neither of those things existed in the 1980s. And so I think there was curiosity or awareness, and some had embraced more and some less, of Vivergav at being a computational biologist and now running big parts of research. There were examples where big pharma companies had embraced, but I think there was either a hesitancy or a thoroughness, depending on how you want to look at it.
Jackie, would you just talk a little bit, you talked a little bit about your organization earlier, but what are some of the things you're particularly proud of that you've achieved?
I mean, well, obviously, building, I think building something that isn't like a tech company or a biotech company, but something that's really truly integrated, and it'll, where people really are challenging each other to do things differently. It's quite, it's interesting because certainly when you're fundraising, you people sort of say, are you a tech company that uses bio, or are you a bio company that uses tech? And it's really thinking about, we're not actually either or, it's a different beast. So I'm really proud of that, and building our pipeline, which is coming together very nicely. But really the baricitinib example, I think, has given us all a huge boost, because it really shows that we can make a difference. So
yes,
and the other thing that hopefully we'll be releasing some news about is our collaboration with AZ, which has been going extremely well. And I think it's really great how AZ has embraced kind of this different way of working, and really looking at sort of co-creation in the disease areas. So those are probably the areas that I think I'm most proud of. But so Benevolent, I said I should have described the company a bit more, shouldn't I? Sorry. I think the other thing about Benevolent is because we have everything from kind of very basic research all the way through to clinical trials, that both helps in terms of informing the way we do things, and being able, as Nick was talking about, thinking very early on about what patient population are we trying to treat here, what would be most appropriate in terms of clinical trial approaches, etc. But also, I mean, and this is a minor point, but because we really early on had to make sure that we were very compliant in terms of the regulatory process, it kind of spawned a sort of rigor across the company in terms of version control and documentation and everything, which has proved to be invaluable later on.
Great. Abraham, what are you proud of?
Well, at Atomwise, we invented the use of deep learning for structure-based drug design. So that was pretty something that I think we're pretty proud of. But beyond that, beyond the inventive step, I think the thing I'm proud of is actually the lengths that we've gone to prove and demonstrate that the techniques we invented work. So I think the history of computational chemistry, you see a lot of papers where the paper is basically structured as, here's my shiny new whiz bang, and then here's a case study where it worked. And whenever you read that kind of paper, it's a little bit dissatisfying, because you don't know if that's, the one case study out of the 1,000 that they tried, if that's the one and it works every single time, if it only works on that specific protein, if it only works on that class of proteins, if it only works within that disease, like what does it really mean, and should you try it? And that's very challenging. And so we looked at that and we said, man, we're just going to have to prove that these techniques work over and over again. We're going to have to show it works on 100 different proteins, 100 different classes, 100 different diseases, just that we have a sense of robustness. We know we're not wasting our time, right? Facebook's hiring, right? Like, we could go get real jobs if it turns out that these techniques are good enough for a paper, but not good enough to really make a difference. But of course, we're not experts in 100 different proteins. Nobody's an expert in 100 different proteins. And so we set up actually one of the largest collaborations, biomedical collaborations, I think, in history, where we partner with different academics who are experts in those proteins. And so, imagine you're a professor at Cambridge or Harvard or Stanford, and you think that blocking protein XYZ would help cure Alzheimer's or cancer or COVID. Well, you tell us that you want molecules for protein XYZ, and we go run our AI system and select the best molecules, and we buy them, we ship them to you, and then you test them in your assay, and then you tell us whether we succeeded or not. And so this allows us to test robustly. So we have over 775 accepted projects to date. We've had covers like 600 unique targets and several dozen countries and over 250 universities and research hospitals in every major disease area. And so across that, and for context, I mean, large pharma might do like 60 to 100 projects in a year. So this is, you know, a significantly broader swath of collaborations and projects that even big pharma does. And that's really what speaks to the power of AI, the ability that it lets you scale beyond what you can do with traditional physical only techniques. And so across that set, we've had 75.7% success rate in finding something that the collaborator says, hey, Yahtzee, that's really exciting. What was in well E4? You know, it seems to work. And so that's a great level of success. So, you know, our commitment to really rigorous prospective testing of these technologies, I think, in addition to having invented them in the first place, I think those are the things that I think we're most proud of.
Nick, what are you proud of?
I think for us, it's having come up with a novel partnership concept with the NHS,
yes,
whereby there's a component of equity that each trust partner gets within the company, support for IT, and then a return on the total projects that we do. And currently we have about 12% of equity in the company. I think then also reducing that to practice in terms of extracting, curating that data under strict information governance requirements that everybody is comfortable with within the NHS, then applying AI and ML to specific research questions, and then partnering that up with pharmaceutical companies in a very short space of time, I think is what we're most proud of, and actually reducing to practice the concept of bringing pharmaceutical collaboration closer with NHS workers, and also deeper understanding of clinical pathways and ways of actually analyzing data across that. And I think doing that quickly at scale, and having done that as a company that IPO'd very early, is something that yeah, we're very pleased with and proud of.
Great. And Martin?
I think for us, it goes back to the beginnings of the company, when for quite a long time, people told us it is completely impossible to automate this very broad and diverse set of experiments, and it would not be possible to do it in the first place, and not kind of for two PhD students more or less right out of university. And I'm kind of quite proud that we have proved a lot of people wrong by in the end kind of developing and building a fully automated laboratory that by now produces a few million data points every week. And we did kind of the metrics, and we can, with many assay types, we can capture more than 100 times more data points per assay, thanks to automation, full sensor arrays, etc. So that for us is a wonderful, wonderful kind of sign of really kind of showing that what we're doing and the way we think about data generation, data capture is something which can work and does make a difference. And that is very closely linked to the second part that I'm extremely proud of, is the group of people we're able to attract. Several academic and industry thought leaders have since joined our team, joined our board, and support us with their advice and with their hands. And that is something which to us is really absolutely amazing, to see how so many people in the industry have really said this is something which we've been waiting for and which we think is the right way of doing things. And then being able to recruit that time of team and supporters around you is really wonderful.
So Jackie, I will throw this to you first, but others, please just jump in. Some of the challenges that the industry will face need to solve in the next, say, 3 years, and are they mainly technical, or regulatory, market-based, or something else?
Well, I think there are quite a lot of challenges. One of them is obviously making making more data available. And one of the things I find very frustrating is there is a lot of negative data out there, which if companies shared it, could be actually at the end of the day, they will gain more than any individual company could possibly lose. I also think that for clinical trials, not sharing negative data, especially now, a lot of it is electronic. I mean, companies are starting to do that. But I think it's really important to respect the patients who took part in the trials, to actually share their data that may ultimately be useful in designing better experiments or better trials. In terms of devices and in terms of software services, decision support tools, clearly there are regulatory issues in terms of if you've got products that are continually improving themselves through access to data, being able to regulate them in a way that's agile and flexible is going to be really, really important. And I think that, again, that is something that COVID may well make a difference. And lastly, I think actually thinking, you've got some very good examples from what Abraham and Nick have said in terms of business models, but really thinking about flexible business models, how you value data. And this is true for both the NHS, for academics and funders and companies, to think about how you can really realize the value of data without necessarily strangling discussions through bureaucracy or unreasonable demands on either side.
Mm.
Can I just riff on something Jackie mentioned there? So I went to a talk and somebody was describing a clinical trial, and the clinical trial had stopped, and they were on the side of the organizers, and they were talking to a patient, and for whatever reason the clinical trial stopped, and so the organizers wanted to express to the patients that they were being very sensitive to patient privacy. And so what they said is, like, for whatever reason, we need to stop trial, restart. So don't worry, we destroyed, your samples, and we're being very, very diligent, very, very thorough, right? Like with your data. And so be careful. Like we're careful. We destroyed the samples, and the patients were furious, right? So this is an interesting thing. I think we hear a lot about patient privacy for good reason, absolutely for good reason. But the patient was furious with them. They said, what are you talking about? I'm dying, right? I want this to be worth it. I want this to be meaningful. And so they were furious with them that what they had endured wasn't going to be used by somebody for something to advance for some other patient. And so there's this interesting balance. And I think if we set expectations, communicate, care about privacy and respectful, but all aligned together, then the kind of sharing of data, I think there's a place, and actually you can get everybody aligned around it.
And also the technology exists now for you to be able to track very securely, how your data is being used.
Yeah, I'd also like to build on Jackie's point about the regulatory piece in this, because I think with the pace of that and the changes that are happening, that the regulatory authorities aren't quite up to pace with what's going on in terms of changes in practice and the potential changes. So I think that's something that needs to happen. And I think also with the AI tools, the requirements for transparency to ensure that the patients and populations see what's happening and understand it is really important in this. And that plays into having a clear and open dialogue, I think. The other thing I think, which is still some way off, I think, is being able to define in these drugs the value proposition. And I think AI potentially is going to have a role to play in that when you're moving through into market access, health economics, seeing how drugs perform in larger patient populations, the opportunity to be able to articulate a pure understanding of value of what a drug is compared to other drugs, how they perform, I think is going to be increasingly important and something that needs to be done.
Martin, challenges?
Yeah, so two points. So first of all, Abraham, thank you for sharing the example with the patient, because there's also my experience kind of as an oncologist as well, that most patients are more than happy for their samples to be used and reused for research purposes. They more or less see it as an obligation. And once they've gone through the procedure, they say, well, now please do use it so that others in the future will get better therapy. So thank you for making that point. When it comes to challenges, I think there's two things. So one is on the technical side, and it's the reason of why our company exists, which is access to high quality data. Because we know that machine learning depends on one thing above all else, and that is the quality of the input data, structure, reliability, quality of annotation, etc., etc. And that is something which is a huge problem, because publicly available data often is, let's say, of very mixed quality. And even if you then get access to it, you still have to clean it. And that can take that can, I mean, if you look at a typical machine learning project time frame, the majority of the time goes into cleaning the data, thinking about how to name things properly. That is the majority of the work. But when the data itself is flawed, it is very difficult to draw any meaningful conclusions. So that's the one technical issue. The second challenge that I personally see is, again, from a clinical perspective, what I would consider kind of to be a certain degree of market failure, where we see that some areas of research are not getting the attention they deserve. Rare diseases, tropical diseases, neglected diseases. I think COVID has shown very clearly that it's extremely important that infectious diseases, for example, should be center stage when it comes to thinking about drug discovery, thinking about healthcare. But instead, up until now, these were all diseases that were more or less kind of pushed to the side. So I think it is extremely important that we think about new and creative ways in which we can sustainably finance research into antivirals, antibiotics, and many other classes of drugs that really kind of the majority of the world's population quite desperately need.
If I could just quantify one of the first point there about, I agree with both points, but just the first point that Manuel was making about quality of data. So last time I checked, there was something like 240 million data points in the NIH's PubChem database of the kind that we tend to look at and we tend to use. 240 million, but 98% of those fail our quality control filters. It's still millions of data points, but just to quantify, to give a sense of exactly how much effort and how important it is to do the cleaning and the filtering, 98% fail our QC.
I mean, I would echo that. And one of the things that I think funders, especially public funders of research, should do more of is due diligence on what research has been funded in the past and by whom, because now you can do that so much more automatically. You know, you've got databases out there like, you know, the US grants database and Research Fish or whatever it's called now in the Gateway to Research in the UK. Because I remember going to a scientific meeting a couple of years ago that I hadn't been to for years and years. And I just wandered around the posters looking at the work. I was thinking, God, we did that years ago. Or I know that was done years ago. And it was, it's like, you just think, why are people not actually accessing this data and stop? I'm all for reproducibility, but not learning from the past repeatedly is not a good thing.
Mm.
I mean,
I think go ahead.
Just one comment exactly on that point, Jackie. I think you're absolutely right. And what I find extremely encouraging is that the FAIR data principles that were only published by Wilkinson in 2016 have already found quite a strong followership globally among scientists, funders, and many other organizations, because we do realize that data has to be findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. Otherwise, it's useless. So I think there's encouraging signals that more and more organizations appreciate the importance of thinking about good data stewardship.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting. There was, some public granting agencies were talking about like, we want to encourage people to make data available, and so you had to like specify a plan in your grant application for what metadata you were going to include, and where it was going to live in the database. In fact, you can make it much easier, which is to get a grant. Part of what when you're applying for the grant is you demonstrate how your previous data was used, right? Like you show the citations using the data, right? Instead of saying, here's how I plan to make it available. If you're actually funded based on other people using your data, then making it accessible and easy to use and good UI and good metadata, all that actually takes care of itself. And so if you just get the incentives right, then the action will follow. On the side of publication, that's one thing. I got to say, on the side of pharma companies reporting, and this is sort of similar to what Jackie was talking about with respect to negative data, would also be hugely valuable, right? Because pharma companies tend to bury their dead at night, and what you end up getting is folklore, right? Or like folk wisdom, and it's this sort of oral tradition which is passed on, where you say, hey, I'm thinking about working on protein XYZ, and people are like, oh yeah, we worked on that, back in 92, and it actually turns out that the kidney expresses this related isoform, and so we had a bunch of kidney talks. You say, oh, okay, well, that's great to know. How do I learn about it? Where do you write it up? It's like, oh yeah, no, we never wrote it because we killed the project, but everybody who was working on it at the time knows it's kidney talks. And so you just kind of have to like bump into people at conferences or Zoom calls, I guess. And there's got to be a better way of doing it than passing on of oral tradition.
I mean, actually thinking about it, you've got databases like Kemble and others. Surely it would be really easy just to get something annotated when people have done that kind of work, just to add it on, you know, but then you've got to have some sort of incentive for them to do it. And there's also the whole thing about quality control as well.
But a database of failure would be really interesting, wouldn't it?
Well, lots of people have talked about that, but it's been a bit of a failure in itself to get it going. The thing is, you've got to make it easy. If it's overcomplicated, or you know, as Abraham was saying, people when they close projects in industry, they're gone. You know, there's no incentive to publish anything.
I think if we had, you know, if you think about the pre-registering of clinical trials before you run them, then that allows you to see whether something occurred or not. And at some point you say, well, if, you know, I'm not going to believe that 25 years later, the phase 1 is still running, right? Like, so I will impute that there was a negative result or whatnot. And so I think if there was kind of a similar, at all levels of research, before you do the experiment, you pre-register what you intend to do, then things like publication bias, where it all skews to the positives, that would handle itself, because then you could say, oh, 100 people said they were going to run that experiment and you were the one that got it to work, right? Like, well, maybe this gives us a sense, what's the posterior likelihood that this is a false positive instead of a real outcome, right? And then it actually makes replicability studies more interesting. Anyway.
So just finishing up, because we're getting close to finishing up. It's gone so fast, the time. Give you all an opportunity individually, just if there's anything that you would like to share, like a tip or some advice or concerns that you have that our audience would be interested to know. Now's your opportunity. Jackie?
I think the most important thing is pay attention to the social side, the culture of your organization, the culture of the people you want to collaborate with. And there's you know, they are, you know, we're bringing together two essentially very different sectors. You know, data scientists want to model everything. Biology is really, biology in particular is very messy, and so people are thinking different. So pay attention to the cultural side and getting people on board with the technology and not being afraid of it. You know, it's about how we can make people make better decisions, ask questions they've never been able to ask before, and really accelerate what we do. But unless you kind of are cognizant about that, you will end up with barriers and blockers, and it won't be as smooth as it could be.
Thank you. Nick?
Yes, I think for me, it's a similar thing. It is culture, and it's having a partnership and a shared agenda of what you're trying to do, and have a clear vision with different groups of people, whether it's on the NHS side or with pharmaceutical companies, but actually sharing that vision. And also, I think the other piece is just carrying on endurance, because you're always going to hit problems and challenges, but actually just saying, okay, how are we going to find solutions to get around those problems and challenges, and just being continuously able to do that and innovate within that space. But ultimately, as Jackie says, it comes down to people that are open and actually want to bring about change.
Martin?
I can only echo kind of those two points. I would just kind of put them maybe kind of slightly differently by saying, one is all of us are in this together, because we're all part of this one industry. And I think we're working in a very fortunate position, because all of us dedicate our careers to bringing new drugs to patients, which is an extremely rewarding industry and a rewarding place to work in. So I think it's very important that we do realize that none of us are going to do this alone, but instead we find like-minded people, those who want to change the status quo, those who want to use technology and accelerate the process. And those people we can find in panels like this one, in the Pistoia Alliance, in many other forums where you can find people who want things to be better. So that's something which I find extremely encouraging.
Abraham.
I think my co-panelists have said it fantastically, and I agree with everything they've said. So let me say something different, just for keep the attention of the audience. And so I think my panelists have been talking about the people involved at every stage and the mission. And so let me now turn to the next step of implementation, the pragmatic approach, that when you have alignment about how you make progress on the vision. And here, I like Richard Feynman's quote about, like, the most important thing is not to fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool, right? Like when you're working on something. And so let me just give a word of caution. I both from personal experience, but also conversations that I have with people. And this is the huge value of prospective testing, and like having a very high bar for convincing yourself that any of these techniques really, really work. So I meet a huge number of people, and basically most machine learning as it's taught today works on retrospective data. You model the past and you see how well you can do the past. And I just want to caution people that predicting the past and predicting the future is very, very different. I meet a ton of people who come to me and say, hey, essentially I have the conversation which looks like this. They say, hey, I can predict yesterday's stock price to within $1. Give me your life savings, we're going to be rich. And you say, okay, well, it's good that you can predict yesterday's stock price, but have you ever predicted tomorrow's? And they say, all right, challenge accepted. And they go away, they come back and they say, hey, now I can predict yesterday's stock price to within $0.10. Give me your life savings, we're going to be rich. You say, well, that doesn't really answer my question. Have you ever predicted tomorrow's? And then they go away and they come back and they say, I can now predict yesterday's stock price to within $0.01. What more could you want? And essentially what you want to tell these guys is, like, I have less confidence now than I did at the beginning of the conversation. because now you've convinced me that you're memorizing something. You memorize something about the past. And they say, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. There are differences when you try to predict the future. And so I would just encourage people that it is a super exciting time. It is going to be transformational. We are entering a golden age. But to really prove out that there are things, the easiest person to prove is to fool is yourself. And so we've got to really run that prospective experiment to convince ourselves that it's working the way we want and hope and pray that it's working.
Abraham, Martin, Jackie, Nick, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate the time that you've given us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Just to echo Bill, thank you so much for an amazing panel. That was incredibly thought-provoking, and I'm sure you'll have sort of left many people with sort of food for thought and many questions for that. So thank you so much for your time and your insights and expertise. To all of those watching, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And I very much hope you'll be joining us once again at 12 o'clock for our next panel, Will Digital Turbocharge Clinical Development? But until then, make connections, do reach out to those that are also attending today, network, and I'll see you all on the other side. Many thanks.